Deliver to us your message for us. Pray that you prepare our hearts for the message that you have for us today, that we can receive you, Lord, with open arms, open hearts. Take in what we need to take in. Whittle away at the person that we are today, so we can be made new in your image, in the name of God. In the name of Jesus Christ, this is our prayer.
You can be seated today. We find ourselves today in Matthew chapter 19. Matthew chapter 19, and we'll be in verses 1 through 12. I want to share this with you today. When I first got sick, we weren't sure what I had, so I was in the hospital. And when I was in the hospital, the doctor came in and he said, this is what we're pretty sure that you have. This test is the only way to prove it, whether or not. So we're going to give you a bone marrow biopsy. And so they were giving me a bone marrow biopsy. And for me, having never had a bone marrow biopsy before, I asked the nurse that came in, how bad is this going to hurt? And the nurse looked back at me and said, you know what? Sometimes some people don't even feel it. That nurse lied to me. That nurse lied. And if there's anybody that I haven't quite forgiven, it's that nurse from Miami Valley Hospital in Dayton, Ohio. Why do I say that today? You know, when I was going in for that procedure, I really wanted to know how badly this thing was going to hurt, what pain was going to come. And even though this nurse was trying to make me feel better, she didn't prepare me for what was about to come. All of that to say this today. As we walk through this scripture, I'm going to make a couple of promises today. Everybody in here, no matter what stage of life that you are in, old, young, married, single, dating, this is going to feel like your toes are getting stepped on, that this is getting pointed out specifically to you. It is not. So as we walk through, what we talk about often is that we need to put a couple of anchors down today. A couple of anchors to protect us from going overboard or from walking away from this place discouraged. And here is the big anchor that I want to put down. That where the ideal is not present, God's grace abounds even more. So as we walk through this and we feel like, man, I didn't make the right decision there. Man, I didn't do the right thing at this time in my life. Understand something. God's grace is bigger than the mistakes that we have made and the mistakes that we will inevitably make when we fall short. Be encouraged today and know that this is out of love, that even though if this hurts, it's for our good, for our betterment. Matthew chapter 19, verse 1. Now when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. And Pharisees came up to him and tested him, asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? And he answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and shall hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. They said to them, why then did Moses command one to get a certificate of divorce to send her away? And he said to them, because of the hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And the disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. But he said to them, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who have been made so from birth, and there are eunuchs that have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive it, receive it. Have you ever before been given parenting advice from somebody that was a new parent? Have you ever felt like a new parent was giving you advice on how to raise your kids, even though your kids were much older than them? Have you ever felt like there's this naiveness with the young trying to give advice to people that have experience that they have no business giving advice to? I would imagine that sounds frustrating. And if I had ever given you parenting advice at some point, having a 2-year-old, I would imagine that may come across as frustrating. Even so, it may come across as frustrating when someone that's only been married 7 years tries to dive into the complexity of marriage, tries to dive into what we are called to do and what we aren't called to do, with all of the differences and all the things that separate each and one of us. It would seem like I am not the expert on this subject, being that I have been married for only 7 years. I understand that, and I totally agree with you. Don't listen to me today. Please don't listen to me. If I go off on a tangent on what I prefer, please ignore it. Do not listen to me, but instead, let's listen to God today as he talks about relationships. Let's listen to what God has to say through Scripture as it pertains to relationships. You see, marriage is an example God uses to explain his relationship with the church. When the marriage separates, when the marriage suffers, it doesn't align clearly with God's view or purpose for what he has called the church to be. Marriage is a story that should bring us into a better understanding of Christ's love for us. So when the marriage suffers, then that story or that example, it's not being clearly shown. But instead, today we are not going to talk about divorce. It's not what we're going to talk about. We need to view divorce as the edge of a cliff. Our goal is to stay away from the edge of the cliff as much as we possibly can. And in doing that, we are not going to work backwards from divorce, but instead we are going to move forwards from singleness. We are going to ask questions, and I'm going to say things that you may or may not agree with, but that we find in Scripture. And that if we do all of these things the way that the Bible has called us to do them, even though it won't be comfortable for us, I can promise you it'll cause us to stay as far away from that cliff edge as possible. So we're going to work forward from singleness. We all know divorce is bad. We know it's painful. Whether we have experienced it ourselves, whether we know people that have experienced divorce, it is never fun. So let's try to stay away from it as much as we can today. Let's start at the beginning of the relationship cycle. The first point that I want to make today is this: do not be afraid to be single. Don't be afraid of singleness. Before we talk about the marriage relationship, we need to know whether or not we actually need one. Now, why do I say that? I remember in middle school, I went to church camp. And when I went to church camp in middle school, and Dave McCracken preached a great sermon. You guys don't know who that is. It's perfectly fine. Dave McCracken preached a great sermon. And at that moment, I surrendered to the call of ministry. In middle school, I knew that one day I was going to be a pastor. Yes, God took me on a journey to get there, but man, I knew at that moment I was going to be a pastor. Other boys also surrendered for ministry at this independent Bible-believing fundamental Baptist camp. They surrendered to be missionaries or evangelists or youth pastors one day. The girls surrendered to ministry also, but a little bit differently. They surrendered to marry a pastor one day. Sounds silly, right? They surrendered to marry an evangelist or a missionary, where us as boys, our goal was for serving God. What we had taught or what was taught was that the highest thing that these girls, even in middle school, could one day ascribe to be is that they could marry somebody that was serving God with their life. It sounds silly, but can we see a disconnect already happening here? Or even in middle school, what are we telling kids? That they are identified, or that their identity is found in this future relationship that they would once have. That doesn't stop just in middle school, folks. In Bible college, people would make jokes that were these kids going to school to get a degree or a spouse? You see, our identity is so uniquely intertwined with the relationship that we want to have one day, that we're expected to have one day. So the first point, the first anchor that we can put down to protect us from the cliff edge is this: don't be afraid to be single. It's okay. It is, if it's within God's plan for your life to be single and to serve Him, wonderful. That should be enough. 1 Corinthians 7:6-9 says, "Now as a concession, not a command," this is the Apostle Paul speaking, "I say this, I wish that all were as I myself am. But each has his own gift from God, one of a kind, and one of another. To the unmarried and to the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single, as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, then they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion." You see, the Apostle Paul is taking a step away here, and he's saying, this isn't a command that I'm making, this is a suggestion. This isn't something that I'm saying applies to everybody, but I am suggesting, I am hoping that more people were as I am. What was he? He was single. The Apostle Paul was a single man. Well, why was it good for the Apostle Paul to be single? For what reason in the world would it be good for the Apostle Paul to remain single? Well, in 2 Corinthians 11:23, we might get a glimpse of this today. Are they servants of Christ? The Apostle Paul is talking about people that don't believe that he is an apostle. Are they servants of Christ? I am a better one. I'm talking like a madman, for with far greater labors, with far more imprisonments, with countless beatings. This is just a list of stuff the Apostle Paul went through. And often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked, and night and the day was I adrift at sea on frequent journeys, in dangers from rivers, in dangers from robbers, in danger from my own people, in dangers from the Gentile, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers at sea. We see a theme here. Danger from false brothers, and toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, and hunger and thirst, often without food, and cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for the churches. Why is that important? Why is that a glimpse into why the Apostle Paul was glad about being single? Think about all of these things that the Apostle Paul said while having a wife and kids. Right? Think about all those things that the Apostle Paul, all the journeys that the Apostle Paul went on. His life was one unending missions trip, and he loved it. Getting thrown out of cities, seeing cities turned upside down for the gospel of Christ. But imagine for a second if in all of that he also had to concern himself with a wife and a child, their safety, their security, not only being a follower of God, a servant of God, but also living up to the expectation of being a good husband and a good father. You see, the Apostle Paul was sufficient in his singleness. He was fine. He didn't think that there was something better around the corner. He was content. And yet, so many times when we talk about singleness, we lose out on, or we miss this idea of contentment. Contentment in what? In our relationship with God. Is God enough for us? Let's be totally honest today. Oftentimes, the answer to that question is no. You know, when preparing this, I was thinking about this story that we see with Samuel. Samuel was a judge in the Old Testament. And Samuel, he was in charge, or he was the judge over the nation of Israel. If people would attack Israel, if people would put people in danger, it was Samuel's job to protect the nation, to preach to the nation, to teach the nation. And he did really well at it. If you read through, Samuel was beloved. He was loved by the people of Israel. And so then there was this meeting that came up that all the leaders of the nation of Israel were together before Samuel. And then they demanded something that distressed Samuel. What they said was, Samuel, we want a king like all the other nations have. We want a king like all the other nations. And then Samuel is warning them, you really don't want a king like all the other nations have. You have God protecting you. If you live in a right relationship with God, then he will fight your battles for you. You don't even need an army for this. And if you are living in opposition to God, then he will judge you. Just live in a right relationship with God and you have nothing to worry about. You don't need a king. And the nation of Israel like, but we want a king. Everybody else has a king. And then we see this conversation in 2 Samuel, or 1 Samuel 8, 6 through 7. You don't need to turn there because I feel like we're going to be all over the place today. But this thing displeased Samuel, them wanting a king. Displeased Samuel, and they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but listen to me. They have rejected me from being the king over them. You see, their desire to have a king like all the nations had, it was proof, it was evidence that God was not enough for them. Yes, that's talking about the nation of Israel, but don't we see this kind of in the culture, or kind of in this conversation about dating today? That there's someone out there that's going to fulfill this thing within me, and if I just find them, like we'll talk about a bit, if I just make a couple sacrifices, if I lower a couple standards in order to find this person that will love me and that will care for me, I will be complete. Well, the problem is that with that mentality, you are saying that God is not enough. I promise you, God is enough. The first step to staying as far away from the cliff that we call divorce is being content in being single. Now, what if then God sends you somebody? What if somebody comes into your life that seems to be there for a special reason? Well, there's the next step. The first step is this: be content with singleness. The second step: do not date an unbeliever. Well, that seems a little extreme. That seems a little fundamental. Well, we're going to dive in. 2 Corinthians 6, 14 to 15. We talked about this verse being totally misinterpreted last week. Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? Or what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? Before we start a relationship with somebody, when we move from friendship to a vulnerable type of intimacy, we need to make sure that they are in a relationship with God. Pause for a second. Stop. Before we move further, I did not say we need to make sure that they prayed a prayer. Can we all agree? I know this is uncomfortable right now. We need to make sure that they didn't ask Jesus into their heart at one point. That's not what we're talking about right now. We're not saying that they are religiously adjacent, that they show up to church, that they are willing to go to church with us, that they look good to our parents. They grew up in a Christian family. We know from talking about a relationship with Christ that does not make a relationship with Christ. So what do I mean? That we need to make sure that they have a relationship with Christ, that they are in, follow with me, they are in a submissive relationship with God. I'm gonna go a little bit further here. They love God more than they love you. They care about God's opinion for their life more than they care about your opinion for their life. Well, that doesn't sound like love, does it? Well, I'm going to say, before we move on to marriage, it is vital for us as believers to make sure that we are not getting into a relationship with somebody that is not a follower after Christ, it will lead to difficulty. It will lead to pain. You see, when you are in a relationship with Christ, what you are saying is that God's kingdom or Christ's kingdom comes first. When I say as a church that we are a kingdom-focused church, it means that we are not focused on numbers, or we are not focused on building, or we are not focused on anything else other than God being glorified. If that means that God is getting glorified here at Covenant, that's great. If that means that God is getting glorified at Restoration Church down the road, that's wonderful. All that matters is that God is receiving glory. Well, as a Christian, our number one goal and focus is God receiving the glory that God is due. Why is that important? Because if the person you are in a relationship with doesn't have a relationship with Jesus Christ, then their first priority isn't to give God glory. What does the Bible say about those people? Bear with me for a second. It's going to sound extreme. They are an enemy of God. I know that sounds intense. I know that sounds extreme. But if they are not for God, then they are against Him. How then can you guys have a great relationship? Yes, there's attraction. Yes, there's chemistry. But your number one goals do not align with one another. And so that when that honeymoon phase is over, when marriage gets difficult, I think we can all agree marriage is difficult, then you will see a stark difference between those two things. You see, when you are not serious about your relationship with Christ and those lines look blurred, when Christ is not your number one priority, then it's easy to miss why there is such a difference. So then what do you do with the person that you're in a relationship with, that you are dating? I want to be clear about this. That you are in a relationship with does not have a relationship with Christ. Trust God will change them, first of all. Trust God, it's a little bit more difficult, will provide somebody else. Or, and this is a little bit more difficult, or that God will comfort you with His sufficiency. What if you're in a dating relationship with somebody that does not have a relationship with Christ? Very kindly and lovingly and respectfully get out of that relationship until God does a work to either realign that relationship, to send you one that fits the criteria that He's called us to, or if that doesn't happen, then that may be a moment where God is saying, right now, you just need to be content. How much heartache for the Christian life would be avoided if we took this part seriously? But what if they are the only person for us? What if this person that I'm dating is the only good person that's come along? Yes, they love me, they care for me, they provide for me. I can witness to them and I can win them to Christ. Well, we're missing the priority here. The question isn't, what do I do about this one person that will fulfill my needs? The problem ultimately is, why doesn't Christ fulfill that need for me? Why doesn't my relationship with God fill that void that's there? If the person that we are in a relationship with does not fit the criteria of point 2 that they are a believer, then we have missed something at point 1. And we need to be content in Jesus. Now, what if both of us are submitting to Christ? What if both of us have a real relationship with Jesus? What does a healthy marriage look like that will guard against the possibility of divorce? Well, it means that we are to commit to something even more difficult. Now understand something. We have moved today from being sufficient and being single, being content in being single. And if God sends us somebody, that we are going to commit to make sure that they love God more than us, that they are submitting to God before they are willing to submit to us or to that relationship. Then we move on to the next point. Seems like we're getting even more and more difficult through this. Ephesians 5:22. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and as himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of the body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and what I'm saying refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let's see that the wife, that she respects her husband. If we're sufficient in being single, if we're committing that the person that we are in a relationship with loves Jesus more than they love us, then we move into what I would say is probably, in our culture today, one of the most controversial verses in Scripture. So with grace, let's walk through this together, okay? First of all, we're gonna start here. Husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. What does that mean? Husbands, we are called to love our wives like Christ loves the church. How did Christ love the church? He died a terrible death. How did Christ love us? Well, we see this in Philippians chapter 2, don't we? That though he was in the form of God, he thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but he made himself of no reputation for us. And he took upon himself the form of a servant for us. And he humbled himself unto death for us. Even the death of the cross, all so that we could be reconciled with God. Understand something. The kind of love, husbands, that you have to live up to if you are committing to marriage is a painful kind of love. It's daily dying to your own wants, needs, and desires for the betterment of the person that God has placed you in. But then it's not only difficult on the husbands. It starts out with wives, submit yourselves unto your husbands. What does it say? Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. So what are we seeing here? Wives, follow the lead of your husband. How offensive is that statement in 2020 today? It's super offensive. But it's the Bible. It doesn't make sense for a whole multitude of reasons. But there's a reason why it's in here, and we're going to get into that. You see, Romans 5:8, husbands, love your wives. It said, while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would even dare today. But God shows his love for us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. We see two very difficult commands, but understand something. They work in concert with each other. They work beautifully together. Why do I say that? Husbands, if you love your wife like Christ loves us, that you are sacrificing your wants, needs, and desires in order for them to have a healthy, productive life, that they feel loved and secure. Who wouldn't want to follow the lead of a person that did that for us, right? Who wouldn't want to follow that lead? If somebody's only goal is for my betterment, man, I'm going to follow that person's lead every time. Wife, submitting to your husband, if your husband knows that you have his back in all things, that you are going to put your wants and desires to the side in order for you guys to be on the same page, even though you might know better. Often enough, you know better. But if you're willing to take a step back and to say, you know what, I'm gonna wait for us to be together on this, Man, how much easier, how much more will the husband want and desire to sacrifice his wants, needs, and desires in order to make sure that this thing is stronger than ever. But understand something. That is the biblical standard. When one or both of these things is absent, we're careening to the cliff. Why do I say that? Because abuse happens when one or two of these things are absent. You know what, wives, you can commit to submit to your husband, but if your husband is only focused on himself, only wants what he wants, is going to do everything he can to get whatever he wants, then you are going to be a doorstep. You are going to be either emotionally or physically beaten down until there's no longer something of substance, something of value that's there. Abuse will happen. How about on the flip side? Husbands, if you love your wives sacrificially, give them everything they want or could ever desire or what they could ever need, and the wife chooses at that moment not to follow the lead of that husband, chooses to get what she wants, only to run that home to belittle her spouse, that person that she is committed to, well, man, that's still abuse. On the other side, how about if both of those people choose not to work as a team together? If the husband goes his own way and the wife goes her own way, where is that going to lead? That is going to lead to a destructive relationship, right? If one or both of these things aren't present, you are inching closer and closer to the edge of that cliff. But what if I don't want to submit to somebody, single person, you might say? Then I would encourage you, enjoy being single. It's not a bad thing. What if we're not ready to get married yet? Then don't get married yet. It's okay. But if God is not at the center of our goals, then what we are doing is we are either very slowly or very quickly going towards an area that just will not last or will not lead to joy. But ultimately, what we have to say is this today: if God is not at the center of our individual lives, He will not be at the center of our relationships. If God is not the most important thing to us before we get married, let's be totally honest, He is not going to be the most important thing to us after we put the ring on. My question is this today: how important is following after God? Will it lead to difficult things? Of course it will. Am I saying this from somebody that has a perfect marriage? Of course I don't. I could tell you about the fights that me and Sarah have gotten into. Some of them have been very dumb fights. Some of them, if I said them out loud, you would think, wow, they are not very mature people. I mean, let's be honest, me and Sarah are going to get into more fights. We're going to get into more struggle. Your relationships, no matter what stage you're in, is going to have difficulty and struggle. I'm not telling you, how do you have a perfect marriage without struggle? I'm saying, how do you have a marriage that avoids the edge of the cliff? It's ultimately submitting to God and then submitting to what God says about marriage. If we're not willing to do that, then we're in for a world of hurt. Every head bowed, every eye closed, no one looking around. This is a time that we call a time of invitation. I want to be clear about this. This isn't me inviting you to come forward. This is not me inviting you to stand in front of everybody and to tell them your deepest, darkest secrets, the things that you're struggling with. That's not it. What I mean by a time of invitation is that I believe each and every one of you, because of the sovereign glory of our God, God is saying something to each and every one of us today. Maybe not vocally, but we're thinking about something. Maybe the things that God is revealing in us fall in a couple of different categories. The first one is this. Maybe as I've been talking, you would think to yourself, none of that makes sense. Why would you commit to God for for the most important decisions of your life? Well, honestly, the answer to that might be that you don't have a relationship with Christ. So what's my invitation to you? To get to know this God that desperately wants to know you. No, you don't have to come up here. You don't have to pray a prayer with me. Just reach out. This God that we've been talking about desperately wants to know you, or you wouldn't be here today. Secondly is this: maybe you're a believer, but you find yourself in a rut. Spinning your wheels, not making very much forward motion. You're trying, but it seems like everything around you is falling apart. That you can't quite get it right, that maybe either relationships or just your relationship with Christ seems to be stagnant in some way. Well, I want to encourage you this. If you're here today, the invitation is this: have a conversation with God. Ask Him to take back control, to lead in the ways that He wants you to go. Maybe today you're just exhausted. You've been serving, you've been faithful, but it seems like you're in it alone. My promise